Well, let's get going then, and welcome everybody to the Data Science Hangout. And a special welcome to anyone who's joining for the first time today. So if this is your first time joining, just to kind of let you know how things work here, it's an all audience-led informal session where we want to focus all of the data science leadership questions that are most important to you all. And so each week I'm joined by a different featured leader. We get to pick the brain of. And so there's 3 ways that you can ask questions. You could jump in live. You could put questions in the chat. And we also have a Slido, which I'll share the link to shortly. But just a reminder that the conversation is recorded and shared up to YouTube for anybody who misses it. Or if you want to go back and check out the recording. But we really do want to make this a open and welcome space where everybody can participate, and we really want to hear from everyone. And I'll say we especially want to hear from people from underrepresented groups in data science as well. And I'm so excited to be joined by my co-host for today, Chase Carpenter, who's the Director of Strategy and Analytics at the Chicago Cubs. And Chase, I'd love to kick it off by maybe having you introduce yourself and a little bit about the work that you do.
Yeah, hey Rachel, hey everybody. First off, sincere thanks for scheduling this and giving me the opportunity to chat today. So as Rachel said, my name is Chase Carpenter. I'm the Director of Strategy and Analytics for the Chicago Cubs. I've been with the organization for just over 5 years. Everything I work on is on the business side. And in a lot of ways, I support most of our major functional areas. So it's ticketing, marketing, corporate partnerships, food and beverage, retail hospitality, as well as our event operations group. We think of I sit on our strategy team, and so we think of ourselves as in a lot of ways an internal resource or sort of internal consulting group for the rest of the business.
Awesome. Thanks, Chase. Well, thanks for joining us today too. And while we're waiting for questions to come in from everyone, I'd love to kick it off with asking you maybe what's something that you're most excited about with regards to data science?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I spent some time thinking about it because I knew that'd be sort of front and center. I spend a lot of my time trying to think about how to drive value out of data science, and more broadly speaking, sort of data as an asset. And so I think even if you just look at my title, Director of Strategy and Analytics, I spend a lot of time trying to find areas of opportunity where we can drive business value out of the data that we have or that we can reasonably go collect. I think there's a wide range of problems out there. Some problems are interesting, some problems drive business value, and so where I try and focus my time is sort of the marriage of the two. And I think more broadly for data science as a profession, we've made some awesome progress, better integrating data and analytics into the business operation, certainly within sports, but sort of across the sort of all industry verticals. And so that's part of that is due to tools and process, and as well as at the academic level, some significant progress in getting the right types of course material into the hands of students as they come up through both undergrad and graduate school. And it's sort of been an awesome evolution that we're sort of actually seeing this marriage of putting data into practice so that you can drive business value for sort of whatever organization you're a part of.
Awesome. And so for some of us who maybe are thinking about Moneyball as our first example of how you use R in sports, could you give us a few examples of how your team's using data science on the business side of the house?
Yeah, so it's when I joined the organization, my first title was Assistant Director of Advanced Analytics, and pretty much everyone thinks that is Moneyball, right? So it's like player analytics, it's R&D, it's the book or the movie if you've seen that. For better or worse, I don't really have any direct interaction with our baseball operations team. We've got a fantastic R&D group downstairs that they do some pretty awesome work. on the business side, a baseball team, the majority of our revenue and sort of our key business really relates to ticketing, right? We host 81 games a year, and so there's a ton of effort and emphasis in thinking about how do we match the right product with customers, how do we drive demand for our business. And so a lot of the problems that I work on are related to ticket pricing, inventory management, and then sort of the extension of that is putting forward a great guest experience of, on a sold out game, we'll have 40,000 guests in our venue. And so there's a big operation to, put forward the best guest experience that we can. And so there's a lot of work behind the scenes to really understand what do our customers want, how can we deliver products and deliver a guest experience that meets their needs. And so that's where I spend a lot of my time trying to improve or sort of evolve what those products are and what the game day presentation looks like.
That's cool. Can I ask you, like, what's an example of a change to the guest experience that would come out of data science?
Yeah, so I think so the example I'll give really was a byproduct of COVID, which has been incredibly disruptive, personally, professionally, sort of across the board. We were not able in 2020 to host any guests at Wrigley Field. We ended up being able to play a shortened season. But we took that downtime as an organization to ask some tough questions on what do we want the business to look like in 3 to 5 years, because we kind of had this extra window of time in which we could plan and prepare. And so from a game day presentation and experience standpoint, what that turned into, we completely overhauled the access control process. So historically, we'd have these long lines and you'd have to go through this metal detector, and it was just, you'd have someone like poking in your bag. It was not a very welcoming experience. And so through some new technology and changes that we deployed in our security footprint, we're able to completely overhaul that entire process. And once you get into venue, we put forward, we moved cash from our venue and put a big emphasis on contactless ordering for food and beverage. Data science specifically played into that in several components because it's thinking about balancing the guest experience. There's certainly some financial components and some trade-offs that we had to evaluate in terms of staffing and what we could actually deliver to our guests. But it was sort of data, it was a very data forward sort of process and understanding the various stakeholders and what's important to each group and sort of how do we find the right balance.
Definitely. And Chris, I didn't see your question in the chat when I brought up Moneyball before. So do you want to introduce yourself and ask that question?
Oh, sure, why not? So Chase, I'm a data scientist here at Air Force Special Operations Command. And the question that I had posted on there is just how much influence did the movie Moneyball have on your job?
Yeah, it's the short answer is a lot. Sorry, were you gonna say something else, Chris?
No, I'm good.
Okay. The short answer is a lot. I was fortunate enough to play baseball through high school and college and had big aspirations to try and play minor league or major league baseball, and then to be a coach or a scout or something. For a variety of reasons, that didn't work out. So I went into the professional workforce. Fast forward 8 or 9 years, and I had the opportunity to join the Cubs organization on the business side, and it was sort of the perfect marriage of what I had spent being incredibly passionate about for the first 22 years of my life, and then marry that with where I had spent 8 or 9 years on the professional side. I am a huge, in my sort of heart of hearts, a huge baseball nerd, and so I still follow Fangraphs and sort of all the Moneyball type stuff in my personal time. Doesn't play as direct a role in what I get to think about when I'm wearing my official Cubs hat.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thanks, Chase. I see there's a few anonymous questions coming in as well. So I just want to head over to some of those from Slido. And the first one was, how much do the players know about analytics and how it affects them?
So I'd say, first of all, some of this is a little bit of speculation and more sort of what I've heard from my colleagues. But I think it really runs the gamut of some players don't necessarily have much appetite or interest in really understanding the Moneyball type metrics that we can produce. On the other end of the spectrum, you get folks who they sort of live and breathe it. I think you've seen a huge emphasis from all the major front offices in trying to find ways to interject more analytics into their decision making, into their player development, and ultimately trying to position each player for success. I think how that actually manifests on an individual player level varies quite a bit.
Thank you. Jeff, I see you just put a question in the chat as well. Would you want to ask that one live? Or I can read it.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm on baby duty right now. Hey, Chase, long time.
I was gonna say, a long time no see, Jeff. Great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. I'm curious what the tech stack looks like at the Cubs, and is it different between, I don't know the terminology you're using, but like retail and professional? Like, are the folks that are doing the actual Moneyball stuff, are they using a different tech stack? And yeah, how is that different from what we were doing 7-8 years ago?
Yeah, it's a good question and awesome to see a friendly face. Yeah, for context, Jeff and I worked together for 5 or 6 years, and then we both gone on our separate ways. So briefly, so our tech stack on the business side, sort of, I think, relatively standard. We have a fairly robust data warehouse infrastructure. Currently, we're sitting on an Oracle tech stack, and we have our IT team sort of formally owns data ingestion, all the ETL work. They also own our business intelligence layer. So in a lot of ways, I sit on top of that. In my day-to-day, I have more specifically, our studio open pretty much every single day. Run most of my sort of analytical work through R. On the baseball operations side, to be honest, we're almost two completely separate companies. I know they have a very heavy R and Python base. They also do a lot of internal custom app development work. And so there's more of a app development focus in that group as well, that they're finding ways to marry the analytics coming out of R or Python and then embedding those into applications that they can push out to coaches and players.
Thanks, Jeff, for your question. And I did just want to say, if anybody writes a question and you don't want me to have you like read it out loud, or if you're in like a loud cafe or something, you could put like a little star at the end, and then I'll know to just read it too. But Ronald, I saw that you had also asked a question in the chat earlier. Can I give you the mic and have you add some context there too?
Yeah, sure. I always like to hear myself talk. I am not a data analyst. I just sort of play when at work. My question has to do with how are your projects or areas of analysis determined? And I ask that because I find myself, at least in this business, working a little bit with ad hoc, where I have to keep an eye on a lot of what is going on in various departments and area, whether that's fiscal or operations or, patient throughput or whatnot. And I do get a certain amount of guidance from, oh, we have this problem, solve it. But yet it's people who really have no idea how to go about that. So actually doing a very in-depth scope of work analysis becomes critical. And I'm wondering what sort of a situation you've encountered there.
Yeah,
and this is a really generic question, just almost anybody that I ask is like, how does one do this optimally? or is there an optimal way?
That's a really good question, and it's something I spent a ton of time thinking through conceptually when I joined the organization. I was the first dedicated business analytics hire, and so I was also joining as a team of one, so finite resource in that respect. I don't know if this is best practice, but what I ended up doing is I essentially developed three criteria and a little checklist that would allow me to have that scoping exercise that you referenced. And really what that scoping exercise boiled down to is sort of what's the size of the prize, or what's the size of the problem. Two, do we actually have data that can help understand or improve the problem? And then three, when does the work need to be done? What's the timing? And by focusing on those three problems, gotten pretty adept at filtering projects that are material enough that sort of warrant a significant investment of time. Two, that we can actually influence through thinking about through a data science or an analytical perspective. And three, fits with the business cadence. And if you sort of strike out or can't check all three of those boxes, then you can facilitate the next conversation of, like, okay, I can't directly help you, but how can we move this forward? And I'll candidly, particularly when I initially joined, you have some uncomfortable conversations because as a service function and a support resource, having to tell your colleagues that I can't directly help you, or here's why this may not be a good fit. Those are tough conversations to have, and it's, but I think necessary conversations so that you can prioritize your time on driving value for your business.
Thanks, Chase. And Livy, I see you just asked a question in the chat as well, if you want to jump in and ask that one.
Sure. Yeah, I was wondering about dynamic, like real-time dynamic pricing models for tickets. That's something that I've always been really interested in as a person who does like optimization and stuff like that. But I don't know how widespread that actually is. And I was wondering how the pandemic might have shifted some of those models for sports teams.
Yeah, so dynamic pricing, it's a big topic and a huge area of focus. As an organization, I believe we began adopting dynamic pricing in 2011 or 2012. So we've got roughly a decade sort of under our belt. I will say I would draw a big distinction in how we think about dynamic pricing versus someone like a leading e-commerce store, someone like an Amazon, where they've got millions of SKUs and they have some humans behind the scenes, but they've deployed machine learning models to sort of algorithmically price and manipulate prices in a somewhat automated fashion. We're not that hands off. So behind the scenes, there's collaboration between myself and our ticketing colleagues, and we're essentially in real time, always monitoring and observing demand as it materializes. We have some analytical models that help us make some estimates on how we may change price, but it is a little more sort of manual and hands-on than at least in an academic setting. When you think about like, this is the optimal dynamic pricing infrastructure, where we've got some real headroom to sort of grow into that type of model.
I think that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I think keeping the human in the loop, like the algorithm loop, is really interesting. And also kind of the algorithm aversion that you might see, where you're like, oh, I don't think that's the right thing to do. I don't want the computer to make the decision for me. That's been an interesting topic. And I think that it's great that you guys use it as a reference and not as something that's automatic.
I think so. Part of this, I think, is the sports industry, right? There's two dynamics that sort of distinguish us from a lot of other dynamic pricing applications. One, we have finite inventory, got 41,000 seats per event. And two, that inventory expires and becomes perishable. So I can't sell a ticket to last Tuesday's game. And then the third part of that is in addition, we have multiple sales channels. And so accurately, you can get some interesting signals in your data that may or may not actually correlate to an increase or decrease in demand. So for example, a large group ticket order, if there is a church group or some, we may sell a chunk of 500 tickets without some proper treatment and sort of, nuanced understanding of how that data actually flows through our systems. You could make the naive, interpretation of, demand is through the roof, no change price. And that may or may not actually have anything to do with the underlying demand, is just like when a group sale closed, for example.
I have a similar question to Robert, who just put in the chat. Should we use incognito mode when purchasing sports tickets? I've always wondered that for concerts.
I mean, I would say this is more my personal bias. I think you should probably use incognito for most of the things that you do on the internet. And I would say that probably extends to purchasing sports tickets. No, I mean, I think both through our official primary channel, Cubs.com/tickets, we have a decently robust ad tech stack behind the scenes that will allow us to sort of track your behavior to some extent, and then show you relevant ads or sort of follow up to that. Certainly if you look at the secondary markets, StubHub, Vivid, SeatGeek, those organizations have very robust ad tech stacks that I'm somewhat envious of, because that's central to the success of their business, and they've made the necessary investments.
So can you tell us, like, buy tickets X days before? Just kidding.
No, I mean, that's an interesting one. People do. We have seen a huge shift of people delaying their purchase closer and closer to events. And so that's a consumer behavior phenomena that we're seeing across all sorts of industries. I think that creates risk for us as a business, going back to my point related to expiring inventory. So as sales get pushed closer and closer to the event date, that just creates more uncertainty for our business, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how do we sort of operate in this environment that we're watching unfold.
Right. I see an anonymous question that just came in that was, since sports games happen so frequently, how are models and analytical projects evaluated over what time period?
I'd say it's highly context specific. In baseball, there's a couple lenses that most of our decisions sort of naturally fall into. One is a yearly cadence. To some extent, the baseball schedule is pretty much set in stone from April 1st to end of September. And so a lot of the work that we do, the true and sort of final evaluation for success, certainly sort of materializes throughout the season, but the real evaluation is after the season has unfolded. More at the operational level, there is success that can be evaluated and changes actually put in practice, sometimes on a game-to-game basis, but more often than not, a homestand by homestand basis. And so it's roughly every other week. So we can make operational changes. The team goes away for 10 days and then they come back, and so we can make some changes in between homestands.
Thank you. Mubanga, I see you had I think a follow-up question maybe to what Libby had asked earlier. Would you want to jump in and ask that? Or we can get back to that one after. I wasn't sure how to summarize the the question in there, but I see there's also an anonymous question for you, Chase. That was
sorry, Rachel, I was on mute.
There you go.
So that was basically a comment based on what Chase explained in reaction to Libby's question, because I was just thinking to myself, because the pricing is dynamic, so it means that the system is changing continuously in time. So I've seen applications before where reinforcement learning has been used in not exactly the same setting, but in settings like that, like self-driving cars, for example. So I was just wondering to myself what kind of algorithm they use at the Cubs.
So I would say So specific to dynamic pricing, we have tested a wide range of different algorithms, sort of decision frameworks. Everything from your sort of traditional classic, regression-based models to non-parametric models. Jeff and I, in our prior life, worked at a consulting shop that specialized in a variety of Bayesian techniques, and so I've sort of messed around and tried to make sort of the Bayesian frameworks fit within the type of data that we have. I will say, having spent a fair amount of time sort of in that area, I think the bigger challenge that we have is more at the data synthesis and aggregation layer, getting the various data sets that you would want in real time or sort of at the right granularity or frequency that we ideally want to make decisions. We run into more bottlenecks at that layer versus any individual algorithm will end up being somewhat performant given the data constraints that we have. So I spend more of my time focused at how can I go get the incremental data at a more finer granularity so that we could sort of more meaningfully engage in more of the sort of true optimization, algorithm optimization.
Thanks, Chase. I see Jeff asked another question in the chat that was, is there any animosity between the Cubs and resellers like Ticketmaster?
It's a good question. So in the ticket distribution space, you've got a couple different entities. You have us as the Cubs, and we sell on our own channels, right? You go to the box office, you can call a phone number, Cubs.com/tickets. Then you have the secondary markets, but you also have the different terms are used, but brokers, essentially people who are in the business of acquiring inventory from us and then selling those tickets in a variety through a variety of channels. I think there is some healthy tension that can arise because the sort of the incentives that each of those parties have may not always align with one another. And so in general, I think our incentives are pretty aligned with the secondary exchanges themselves. We want to have the sort of the broadest distribution pipes that we can and sort of get our tickets in front of people sort of wherever they are and however they want to purchase. Those exchanges, they're obviously interested in helping to sell Cubs tickets, but they have a huge portfolio of live event inventory that they also care about. So there's just, I don't think we've perfected the business model or sort of the relationships between all of the various parties. But in general, we work pretty well together.
Thank you, and apologies, my audio just got a little cut out for a second, so let me know if it sounds weird to anyone. But I think I missed a question earlier, Sep, that you had asked, and sorry if I've missed any other questions earlier too, but can I pass the mic over to you for that one?
Yeah, sure. So I think you had referred to someone asked a question about your tech stack earlier, but I kind of wanted to understand a little bit of that last mile of how you deliver your results to the business.
Yeah, so I'd say a couple avenues. We build and maintain a small number of Shiny applications, which ends up being sort of the deliverable. A fair number of outputs will be injected back into our data warehouse and then rendered through our BI layer. But also, I'll admit, at least for our business, a lot of my counterparts across the organization still rely pretty heavily on effectively the Microsoft stacks. It's Excel, it's PowerPoint, it's Word. And it's been a big ambition of mine to get away from that mindset, but it's a real reality. And part of it is a lot of the outputs that we generate make their way into other source documents or deliverables that I don't own or sort of have much purview into. Certainly collaborate, but like board materials. If we're putting a board deck or a memo together, need to provide deliverables that can easily be dropped and lived in those documents.
Thanks.
Can I dive a bit deeper there? Because I'm sure that a bunch of people on the call have that struggle as well. Like, how are you going about trying to change that, or like working together with the team?
I'm not sure I have a great answer. I think internally, I am making a conscious effort to shift more and more of our deliverables into more reproducible, R Markdown, or just sort of fully contained scripts and processes, and then sort of go kicking and screaming when we need to break that paradigm. But that's it's a constant sort of tension, or something that we're always evaluating.
Mm-hmm. So with our Markdown, does the team also like generate PowerPoint or Word from our Markdown too? Or
I've tried, to be honest, given, and this is sort of in the weeds on the specific formats and sort of the preferences that we have in those templates. I haven't been able to fully close the gap and get sort of 100% continuity there. I'm sure it could be done. It's more of a timing and resourcing thing.
Yeah, that's something I hear a lot from like the Excel reports perspective too, like around certain formatting. Tatiana, I see you had a question you just asked in the chat as well. Would you want to ask that one live?
Sure. So you did mention, Chase, that you deal with ambiguity and uncertainty a lot. So I'd be curious to hear, what are your most go-to techniques for approaching ambiguity, and where do you basically stop and say, hey, this is the threshold where I'm about to accept it and I'm not going to dig further? And the second question was just about your journey since you started on as a one-man department. How did your role evolve, and what aspect did you enjoy most? From business analysis to data science, it seems like you're more into data science right now, and I'm curious to hear how it started.
Yeah, both good questions. I'll try and I'll take them in order. So, in thinking about uncertainty, I think as an organization, I think there's two questions. There's two questions embedded in there. One is more the mechanically, how do you think about and actually quantify the uncertainty from an analytical perspective, and I go back to a lot of the Bayesian frameworks that I was introduced to in my first job. Right? They've just got some nice academically rigorous and just like conceptually sound manners to actually to think about confidence intervals or credible intervals, and so I use those frameworks sort of mechanically. I think where I have spent a lot of time is getting my colleagues and counterparts in our organization comfortable with embracing that uncertainty. A lot of the areas where I spend my time, our analytical deliverables are due several weeks or months in advance of those events actually happening. And sort of, to sit here in the first week of November and with 100% specificity say, here's my projection for the ticket sales next July, it's really hard to make that argument. So, but I've spent a lot of time getting our organization to understand, like, here's the range of probable outcomes. Here are the things that would make us believe that we may, over-index or sort of underperform, and how much risk or uncertainty are we willing to accept, and sort of what's the downside of if we misproject, or what's the cost of being wrong. And that's taken the better part of my 5 years here to sort of get folks to fully embrace. COVID-19 was somewhat beneficial in that, because we had so much uncertainty facing our business that uncertainty, it was front and center, and there was no other way, at least in my opinion, to like reasonably think about what may happen in our business than through sort of a truly probabilistic manner. I'm sorry, your second question was more on
on how your role basically evolved. But going back to uncertainty for a second, so you first build out your model and then you accept stakeholders. So you consult them on what level of uncertainty they're willing to accept, or do you set it beforehand and you have a conversation like, here's my data, here's how far we can go, and here's the levels of uncertainty we can dig into. Is that a conversation you have beforehand or after you build your model? Or it depends?
And to some extent, it depends. I try and, before materially engaging with colleagues, I try and get sort of push the analytical models as far as we can. So I have an understanding on here's how much sort of statistical power, how confident we can be in these results, and then also framing up, we are getting into the grounds of like, we don't have specific enough data, or there's just more uncertainty. You're sort of crossing a threshold of we're asking for precision that this model can't really support. And so let's take a step back and sort of understand what those limits are. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of does. Because there's no, it's hard to answer a vague question, right? So yeah. And the second question was about just your role, how it evolved. I assume that since you were the first person, right, as far as I understand it, in your analytics department in your company, how much did you have to spend on the buy-in and business analysis, etc.? Or if the stage that the company was in when you joined them was, I guess, cognizant enough of the processes, so you didn't have to spend a lot of time on educating, I guess. And which aspect did you enjoy most as your role evolved?
Yeah, so when I joined, the organization had recognized the need to bring on some more resources in the business analytics area. So there was a little bit of initial buy-in that had already sort of occurred that led to my role being created. Having said that, in any organization, you're ultimately building relationships with individuals, and so I was pretty conscious in finding some quick wins and sort of early victories that I could find to gain that credibility, so that we could grow into bigger, more complex and challenging problems. When I joined, I'd say most of the problems that I initially worked on in the first 12 to 18 months were sort of pretty pure play analytics. Like, the problems were well defined and scoped. There was a clear analytical angle that we could bring to the table, but it was pretty well boxed. As I have progressed through my 5 years here, more and more of the work that I spend on, or where I spend my time now, is addressing bigger strategic issues for the organization and sort of somewhat major sort of policy decisions that we are evaluating. And I certainly own and sort of bring the consumer and the data perspective to the table, but there are very real sort of non-quantitative other stakeholders and other considerations that as an organization we need to evaluate. And we have a very large media presence as an organization, and so we're very conscious of the messages that we put into the market and sort of our standing just from a PR standpoint. I've not figured out how to weave that into my analytical models, but that it's a very real consideration that it's more of an open discussion and dialogue with my colleagues.
Thank you.
I see Robert had also asked earlier, what does collaboration look like with various vendors that the Cub uses? And then Libby kind of had a +1 to that asked, are vendors connected in any way as far as data sharing, like from a connected supply chain perspective?
So I guess I can, Libby, do you mind helping me understand the second part of your question in a little bit more detail? Could go in a couple of different directions there.
Sure. So I was wondering if the Cubs have visibility into the data of suppliers or vendors, and if that goes the other direction as well, if it's even present.
I guess, sorry to keep diving in here. Are you thinking sort of specifically in consumer type data, or more just other like operational business data that we need to create?
So I would say a little bit of both, whether that's information about your consumers that are coming from vendors who might be servicing ticket sales, or if it's more of a supply type thing where you guys have, business suppliers, do they have visibility into your supply chain, or do you have visibility upstream or downstream in that sort of sense of the word?
Got it. Okay, thank you. Super helpful. So I guess a couple parts to that. The main driver of customer data are ticket sales. So we have sort of complete visibility into the ticket sale process. We have 4 or 5 years ago, we began delivering all of our tickets mobilely, so you can no longer print a ticket. You don't get a hard stack ticket. You can't do like print at home PDF thing anymore. So through that, we're generating a lot of data, right? So now we get ticket forward data, and so we get more insight into sort of who is actually attending a game. And the next evolution of that we unrolled for 2021 is through our mobile ordering footprint. Now we can actually tie individual, now we've got pretty good insight into the ticket data. Now for the people who leverage our mobile ordering platform, now I can actually start to understand food and beverage preferences about that individual, which we've never had insight into before. Right? Historically, you go up to the concession stand, you buy whatever you buy, we get like the last four of the credit card, but no meaningful way to tie that back to any individual. So that's been sort of the main sources of data. We also own our own Wi-Fi deployment, so we generate some customer data there. We do have, obviously, we have a decent footprint in terms of digital spend across the social media websites, and so we kind of fit into probably their like small and medium business category. But we have active engagement and collaboration with them to sort of improve our marketing operations, basically.
Thanks, Chase. I know at some of the like ARN sports analytics meetups, a lot of people have questions around how to like get that first job in sports. I'm curious to hear your perspective there on maybe how you did that or how you'd advise others to go about that.
Yeah, so I think finding the first job in sports is often the most challenging one. I think once you've found a foothold, it's a pretty, particularly on the business side, it's pretty open and sort of collaborative community, and so you see a fair amount of not job hopping, but you can sort of navigate the professional team landscape somewhat, I won't say easily, but it happens quite a bit. In terms of putting together a strategy to land that first job in sports, I'd highlight a couple things. One, I'd go back to sort of where I started. If your preference and priority is to work in sort of the baseball or the player operations side of the house, there's a pretty clear path of developing some expertise in being incredibly smart and sophisticated in understanding player performance. On the business side, at least for me, I had really no understanding of how the business of baseball worked before I got into the business, but there's some good publicly available resources for not only baseball, but all the major sports. I think Forbes does a really good job of just synthesizing, here's how the business side of these operations work. And so I spent some time just level setting and really understanding how businesses operate. The second focus I have is you need to get a little scrappy and tap into your network and find friends or friends of friends, reach out on LinkedIn, or if you Google Cubs front office or any team front office, you'll find sort of the full roster of employees. So look at the job descriptions, look at the titles, look at the individuals, reach out, start to build some connections. The third one is, be patient. In general, all front offices are smaller than maybe most people would think, and so jobs don't necessarily have a predictable hiring cadence, and so be patient and do some diligence to figure out when jobs do become available. And the last thing I'd highlight is if your heart is set on working for a front office, I'm certainly not going to tell you to not go down that path, but there are some awesome jobs available in what I'd say the front office adjacent industries. the major concessionaires all employ hundreds of thousands of, or not hundreds of thousands, but hundreds of analytics focused professionals. There's a great sort of cottage industry of consultants that focus on the sports space. So depending on your preferences and priorities, you can land a job in any number of sort of sport adjacent areas. So the last thing I'll say is it's a little bit self-serving here, but I am looking to add a couple folks to my team. We've got one job description up right now, and another will be up shortly. So if anyone is interested in focusing on improving the business operations, cubs.com/jobs, and we've got some opportunities available on our team.
Awesome. Something that might be helpful to dive into deeper here, and maybe with the whole group as well, is when we talk about like being able to find these opportunities and networking. I wonder how like finding a diverse pool of candidates also plays into that, and what are some of the things that your organization does?
Yeah, it's a challenge. We're making a very conscious effort to try and raise the brand awareness and profile of our organization to groups who may not otherwise naturally find cubs.com/jobs. The tactics on how you execute that are somewhat specific to the individual roles, but it's a big emphasis and priority for us as an organization that I think we had. It's just an area that we can get better and evolve, and so it's making conscious efforts to increase sort of the top of the funnel. How do we raise our brand awareness and footprint so that we can attract a more qualified and diverse group of candidates? It's something that we're spending a lot of time trying to evolve and get better at.
That's great. Thank you. I see there was another anonymous question earlier that asked about what you originally studied. Was it analytics, or how did you get into this space?
So my undergrad work focused on political science and psychology, so not terribly heavy on the data analytics front. My first job, I feel like I got the equivalent of a master's in applied statistics, so a lot of on-the-job training. I supplemented that with some graduate coursework in statistics, and then I went back and did my MBA part-time with a focus on operations, analytics, and marketing. But I'd say most of my practical, what I use in my day-to-day really came from my first job.
Mm-hmm. And are there certain skills that you're hiring for right now, or certain things that you're looking for those open roles?
I would say yes. So one, just so we're looking to bring on a pricing analyst, someone to help us get smarter on sort of all the things that we talked about previously with respect to pricing. And the second role is more database marketing and sales operations focused. I think in terms of skills, I think I need someone to be successful in these roles in particular, and I think this does apply to a lot of analytics focused roles in sports, is you need to be comfortable with wearing a couple different hats. I am not a database engineer by trade, but nonetheless, unlike working at a big tech company where you've got seemingly unlimited resources and people can get incredibly hyper focused and specific on very interesting and niche problems, we need someone who's a little bit more of a generalist and comfortable wearing a couple different hats. So people who have background in statistics who have sat in the chair at another company, sport adjacent, is super helpful. I think the other thing that interesting contrast between my first role as a consultant and what I in my current chair is I get to sort of wear the consulting hat, but we're also the operator, and so there's a much bigger emphasis and focus on practical analytics that we can actually deploy. Whereas at least in my previous role as a consultant, we got to do all this super interesting and fun analytical work, but ultimately you kind of hand that over to the client and then you go on to the next project. We have the burden of actually putting into practice what we what we build, and so having more of the mindset and sort of wanting to take ownership of the full analytical process end to end, which is a little bit different than what at least when I went through school, there wasn't a ton of focus on that last part of like how do you actually move a business forward through the application of analytics.
Yeah. Russ, I see you just asked a question. I'd love to turn that over to you to ask live.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Chase, love the content so far. One thing that affects a lot of us that work in financial services are systematic shifts in data, right? So think about something like COVID, right? Drastically affected consumer buying behavior, and it really wasn't something we had seen historically, in our data lakes and data warehouses, right? So certainly complicated my job and my team's job a lot because a lot of our models were misfiring pretty badly, right? And I think, sports analytics has always been something that's been very interesting to me, like full disclosure, Cleveland Indians fan or Guardians fan. So I still haven't gotten over 2016 yet. I've been fascinated by like ESPN's FPI and some of the stuff they do in Georgia Tech related to college basketball, but I'm thinking about specifically with the Cubs, right? And sort of like the transitional state they're in the organization, specifically, trading away Schwarber and Baez and, I forget the gentleman who went to San Francisco, but I would have to imagine that's going to make a lot of your historical data a little less useful for you and your team. Do you have any tips or strategies, or have you guys started, digging into this and seeing what you can do to sort of like make your maybe previous models better fitting for the new reality you guys are going to be in?
Yeah, that's a great question. You sort of hit on the fundamental crux of what I think it means to sit on the business side of a sports organization. Somewhat in an abstract sense, all teams, sports are cyclical by nature, right? And that's due to a variety of reasons, mostly a lot of it's team performance related. Our job on the business side is to smooth out those natural team performance cycles. And, when team performance is really good, our job is to push the business forward. And then when team performance takes a step back, like we just saw at the most recent trade deadline, it's to sort of mitigate the loss or put don't let the floor go as low. And so our job is to mitigate sort of that natural team performance cycle and move the business forward somewhat independent of where we're at in any given team performance or competitive dynamic cycle. That's the abstract answer, and that's my like guiding light and how I think about how I can impact the business. More mechanically, to your point, we are in a drastically different demand environment and just sort of team performance cycle today than we were even 4 months ago. What I have done from a practical standpoint is, we have pretty good historical data, and if you go back to 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, the Cubs were not terribly competitive. And so what we have done is put a little bit more emphasis on more further back in time, but data and demand profiles that is a little bit more representative of where we can reasonably expect team performance to be moving forward. So, just think from like a weighting standpoint or just kind of the types of data that we emphasize in training our models. I'll say to some extent, we do try to directly incorporate some team performance dynamic elements into our models, whether that's expected wins or playoff probabilities. There's some somewhat easy things that we can calculate that we can sort of update over time, but it's a hard problem.
Yep, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Ronald asked a great question, and I think he had to drop to another meeting, so I'm just going to read it. But earlier when we were talking about presenting deliverables, you mentioned Markdown and Shiny. The question was, to what extent is leadership able to process this information? Or do you guide leadership through the results? along those lines, you're providing presumably much deeper information than the PowerPoint Excel crowd, and how is this difference perceived by leadership?
I think my best answer to that would be it's highly specific based on the individual characteristics of those individuals, and we sort of have the full gamut of, you know, my direct boss loves to get into the weeds. He wants to understand, why did you choose this algorithm versus that? What happens if you change these assumptions? And so we spend a lot of time, you know, looking at in our script and like, you know, here's conceptually what's going on, and like here's the relative impact of these different assumptions. Is that my boss sort of over indexes on that side of the things. On the other side, you've got other individuals who don't, not that they don't have the appetite, but they're more focused on the business outcome. And it's been somewhat of an iterative process to understand what resonates to what audience, and tailoring and catering those deliverables to those individuals.
Thank you. Livy, I also think you had a question earlier around the biggest false assumptions that people generally make. Do you want to add any context to that one?
I think that I've just been thinking a lot about assumptions lately, and how I'm usually wrong when I make assumptions about how other organizations or even individuals use data, and the level of complexity that they actually use them at, and the application areas. So sports is something I'm not familiar with, and I would like to kind of ask what the biggest assumption is that people make that's just totally wrong.
Somewhat tongue in cheek, but the question I still field from friends, family, people I meet is like, am I hanging out in the clubhouse and like having dinner with our players? And that's like, could not be farther from the truth. You know, all those guys, they're kind of doing their own thing. But I think sort of more directly to your point on sort of assumptions about our core business operations, I think people have a lot of assumptions about where decisions are made, and sort of who is sort of running the show to some extent. And pretty much all of your major sports teams are in some capacity owned by private ownership group, and those owners have different media personalities themselves and individual and family brands. That depending on the organization, they may or may not have anything to do with the day-to-day operations. But nonetheless, when you know, if you follow Twitter or sort of major media outlets, the characterization of the decision-making process as it gets described by the media is often pretty far from, you know, what I observe on a day-to-day basis. And by and large, it's one of those things that we're not really equipped, or wouldn't necessarily be in our best interest, to try and change those perceptions. So we just kind of shrug your shoulders and go on. But it's interesting seeing how stuff that I am directly involved in behind the scenes ends up getting portrayed in the media. And sometimes it's spot on, and other times you're just kind of like, that's not how this works.
Thank you, Chase. As we get to the top of the hour, I know some people might have to run. So I just want to ask, what's the best way to get in touch with you if people have follow-up questions, or if they're interested in any of the roles? Is it LinkedIn?
Yeah, I'd say I'm pretty easy to track down on LinkedIn. So I please encourage anyone to reach out via LinkedIn if you have any questions specific to the roles, certainly, but more generally, if you have an interest or just want to learn more about the sports industry. I obviously know the most about baseball, but have some decent perspective on other leagues as well. But yeah, please do reach out, and I'm usually pretty good about responding.
Awesome. Thank you, Chase. If it's okay, can I ask you maybe one or two more questions I just want to make sure I didn't miss any. I'd love to hear what advice you have for maybe someone who's on the call right now that's hoping to get into a leadership position, and how they could move from being that individual contributor into leadership.
I feel like the biggest jump there, it's probably not in the hard skills category. I think in order to move up, I sort of think of the hard skill, the proficiency and excellence in what I think of like the hard data science type skills. That's somewhat of a table stakes criteria. So you need to show a sort of minimum level of competency or excellence in that category. But where I think you can start to differentiate yourself is more in the soft skills. It's the leadership, it's the negotiation, it's the team building. It's sort of all the stuff that can be described as like the soft, fluffy skills. But when you think about, I think high performing organizations have tightly aligned strategy and data analytics functions. And so when I think about what does a aspiring leader need to do, it's starting to develop a knack for what is the strategy of the organization and how can I influence that. Data in a lot of ways is a tool that can very meaningfully improve organizations. But it's sort of, I think you can really differentiate yourself on sort of outperforming your competitors in some sense and those soft skills.
Thank you, Chase. And I just want to say, if I've missed anybody's questions, I'm trying to slide through in the chat here, but please feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in live too. Do a quick check. I don't see anyone that unmuted. One last question, Chase, I'd love to ask you. I'm trying to help bring more resources together for someone who's just trying to start advocating for data science internally, and maybe they're the first data person. How would you, I guess, tell someone to go about that process if they're in a position where they actually just have to start at getting approval to even use some of these tools?
Yeah, I think where my head initially goes, and this sort of goes back to some of my MBA classes, but I think it's a pretty simple framework of what's the ROI that you think you could reasonably drive. And right, so I would think about it of engaging with each of sort of the major stakeholders in an organization and understanding what are your problems and basically how you can think about it in terms of revenue or just like efficiency, right? If this business unit is operating at 80% efficiency, what's it mean to the business if we can move that to 85% or 90%? Think about some way to quantify that, balance that up against whatever what resources you need to bring to the table to unlock that 5 or 10% improvement. And that, I think about that in sort of the broadest sense of its headcount, its technology, its investment in data warehousing, right? Sort of depending on where that organization is, that could go in a lot of different ways. But, for my group, we think about driving essentially a 5x return on the investments that the organization make in our group. And that's the sort of the benchmark and the threshold that I'm held accountable to. It's worked well here. And I think it's a good sort of forcing function to make sure you're focusing your time on the right problems that can sort of meaningfully drive the business forward.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Chase. I really appreciate you joining and jumping on here and sharing all your insights with us. I hope to get everybody together in person at some point too. And I know we talked about maybe next year, there's the Sloan conference, Sports Analytics Conference in Boston, maybe planning a meetup or something around that as well, if other people are going to be in the area. But thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel, and thanks everyone. Great questions and dialogue today. I really enjoyed it. So thank you all.
Have a great rest of the day, everyone.